Hi, I'm Mr. Esty, and I'm here for a long overdue part 3 of our bonus series in our ASAP debate videos. And as I said in my last video, part 3 is going to be about coming into hostile environments to debate. Now, this is an issue that arises a lot in real life, of course, because very often real life debates are in front of audiences of whom maybe at least half, sometimes even the entire audience is against you. If you get into high stakes debates, you're often going to be trying to persuade people in avenues where most people are predisposed against your way of thinking. And that might not just be a matter of opinion, it could be a matter of identity. They might have some part of their identity that is strongly committed to opposing what you believe. So that's a challenge that we have to meet. But also in competitive debate, in Philadelphia in particular, we've often had very successful schools and very successful students who then bring their successful students to outside tournaments in the PCFL. That's the Philadelphia Catholic Forensics League, or in the NSDA, the National Speech and Debate Association. So we're trying to qualify for PCFL regional championships, for FISL state championships, for NSDA national championships, for NCFL national championships. And a lot of these tournaments are taking place in suburban schools, in private schools, Catholic schools, schools that are very different and in which the judge pool is very different and the opponents are very different from what we're used to in the high school debate league here in Philly. Just to put it out on the table and avoid euphemism, in Philly we have an extremely diverse debate league where many of the strongest debaters, in fact, I would argue the dominant debaters, are often girls. We have openly queer debaters. We have a huge amount of racial diversity, including very, very strong teams from charter schools, from magnet schools, from neighborhood schools. And we have a makeup that is really different unfortunately, from the rest of the country. In fact, Philadelphia does such a good job of promoting gender equality and the involvement of girls in debate that we were recognized and given a grant by the NSDA for our work bringing more gender diversity into debate. Because throughout most of the country, debate is mostly white boys, to be perfectly frank, or Asian boys. And those demographics can make for a hostile environment when you go to an outside tournament. It can be very hard to walk into a Catholic school and debate a topic about Israel with a team of whom half my students were wearing hijab, for example. That's uncomfortable. It can be very hard to walk into a room and be prepared to debate something about Cuba with a Cuban American person who's wearing an anti-Castro slogan on his shirt, for example. That's another thing that's actually happened. So there's also a difference in norms. Typically in tournaments, debaters are asked to dress up, business casual, but standards of what it means to dress up differ from place to place. And yes, I definitely have had students who have been criticized by the judge for what they were wearing. All girls, of course. And I definitely have complained to the tournament directors about that because that's totally inappropriate. No judge should ever be basing their decision on what you're wearing or even commenting on what you're wearing, whether verbally or in their writing. So, as you can see, and I'm not saying here that the judges were bigots or that the suburban teams are inferior or that suburban teams are necessarily discriminatory at all. It's a matter of walking into an environment where you're outside the norm. That can be very difficult for a sport where you're trying to persuade someone to see things your way. That makes it a lot harder if the other person sees you as other or sees you as different. It gives you a much higher hill to climb, even if that person is doing their absolute best to be a fair and impartial judge. So how do we deal with this? Well, there are several ways. First of all, you should know the environment you're walking into. This is especially important in major tournaments. It's very common in debate for judges to have preferences. This is a term we use for anything that the judge wants you to know about how they judge debate. So their preferences for how students interact with each other. They might say, oh, it's really important for me to be civil, or I really want to see you emphasize areas of clash. They might have preferences for how you use certain speeches. For example, some judges want to see direct connections between everything in summary and everything in final focus, and they'll disregard anything in final focus that wasn't connected to something in summary. And in their preferences, they'll tell you that. In a lot of major tournaments now, the judges will actually write out preferences before the tournament, and they'll be posted online, so you can look them up. And you can actually strike judges if they're either if you've had them before and there's a personality conflict, or if you read their preferences and there's something you really don't like there. You can actually ask, please don't put me with this judge. Usually a limited number of strikes. But even if you don't have access to a judge's preferences before the round, you can ask a judge before the round starts. Judge, before we start, do you have any preferences? And most experienced judges will be able to explain that. If a judge looks at you like they don't know what you're talking about, then that's indicative as well. That shows that you have an inexperienced judge, and you're going to need to tailor your arguments for an inexperienced judge. And that brings us to our second part, is you want to tailor your arguments to your audience. So for example, oftentimes my teams in Philadelphia rounds will come with imperialism contentions about how this policy is strengthening U.S. imperialism, and then we talk about the harms that imperialism does. In Philadelphia, that's a really easy contention to stick, because virtually anyone who's judging in the high school debate league is familiar with the concept of imperialism and is already on board with the idea that imperialism is bad. If you go to the suburbs, that's not necessarily true. And we often either cut our imperialism contentions or heavily modify them, because it's not that you can't win with imperialism contentions or imperialism arguments in PCFL tournaments, but that having to establish what imperialism is and having to explain it and explain why it's bad takes so much speech time that it's not even worth it. You just want to do something else. So that's an example of how you might need to tailor your arguments differently. If you know you have an inexperienced judge, then you want to speak a little slower, which means you might not be able to include as much evidence. But that's fine, because the experienced judge will also not expect as much evidence. If you have an inexperienced judge, you want to make sure you're using as little jargon as possible. You don't want to assume that they understand every debate term. So by tailoring your arguments to your audience, you can help avoid some of the potential pitfalls of being in front of a hostile environment. Going in another direction, you can actually lean into the hostility. Humor is your friend. Humor is a great way to build connections. Humor is naturally about you and me sharing an understanding in the joke. So your ability to use humor, not in an obnoxious way, not in a vicious or bullying way, but pleasant humor, even self-deprecating humor, that's really helpful for diffusing tension and getting people more comfortable with you and getting people on your side. And this is especially important in real life. If you can start by building a base of common understanding with your audience, humor is great for that. And that base of common understanding gives you a door to then try and convince them, or at least influence them, with the actual point where you disagree. Now, I have one more suggestion for actual competitive high school debaters. And that's focus on the things that you can control. You don't do yourself any favors by going into rounds or coming out of rounds wondering, was that judge prejudiced against me? Did that judge have a bias? Did I lose a round unfairly? It's not that those questions are wrong to ask. Judges are sometimes biased. They do make wrong decisions. People do get unfairly screwed over. But thinking about that when you're debating is just holding you back. It's wasting energy. You want to focus on doing the best job you can with the case you have, in the room you have, in the round you have. And all the concerns about fairness and bias, I'm not saying you should ignore them. You should offload them to your coach. Describe to your coach how your rounds went. Communicate with them. If there's something that seems like it might show bias, talk to your coach about it. And then go back to preparing for your next round. Because your coach is the person who has the power to go to tab and make complaints if they feel it's warranted, or to prepare your team for a pitfall that you ran into for the next tournament, or to make the determination whether something was against the rules or not. In any case, it can be something that you lay on your coach, who doesn't have to debate your rounds. Let your coach worry about it. You worry about winning debates. Now, I'd love to go further into the experiences of some of my students in different tournaments, and I'd love to look at ways in which leagues can be more welcoming to students like our students in Philadelphia. But in order to do that, I really would want to get the voices of my actual students. I don't think that I'm the best vehicle for those stories. So instead, I'll just leave you with a wish of good luck, and I really encourage you, all debaters, especially all Philadelphia debaters, try to get out to the outside tournaments. It's a whole new world. It's a new level of challenge. You will grow as a person and as a debater. Don't let anything I've said today discourage you from trying to compete at the highest level that your talent and skill and drive can get you to. And above all, happy debating.